Good morning and welcome everyone to our final session with Nicanor. Now for 4 days we've been mesmerized and blasted with questions by our own questions and Nicanor's questions, and I think we have about an hour and a half now to get all of our answers. It's not too much to ask for, I guess. So I'm hoping that Nicanor will show us how to outsmart our smartphones, create connectivity without Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, and how they can become compatible for what's coming towards us from the future. So here he is, our one and only, our own superhuman, Nicanor Perlas.
Yeah, by the way, Annette, I'm not going to do all those things. And I'm not superhuman. Okay, just to make sure that I don't raise expectations too high. Okay, maybe the gist of what I'm saying, if I'm going to summarize it all so that we can just kind of get a context of where we're at, is that, yeah, it's the context. There is a specific context where this technology is developing, and there are aspects of the technology that are not yet, in a sense, perfected and is evolving. And despite that, there are a lot of good things that are happening with this technology. But I just wanted to try for us to understand the larger context to really have a conversation about moral technology. Because if you just stay in the current level, then it will be very, very difficult to have that conversation. Except, of course, for the safety aspect of AI, which is very important, very central, with all its challenges. And to do that, I was asked a question. I had a conversation with Gotthard. Very interesting name, right? The heart of God. That's the German name. That's the correct translation, Gotthard?
One of.
Okay. And he's a musician, among other things. And I actually asked him the question, can you speak about music produced by a human being and electronic music, basically the quality and so on? Just kind of briefly. Yeah, please.
1 minute?
Yeah, something like that. I'll have to ask him to stand close.
It's a rich field, and I want to limit that to one aspect, the transition from the vinyl, how do you say?
Vinyl
LP, LP to the CD, the digitized CD. Yeah, we call it the analog and the digital sound recording. In that process, and I just say it from the musician's point of view, not the technical data, because it's very complex. You can hear the difference when you listen to a live musician, and then you listen to a black LP, and then you listen to a CD. What happens is the sound spectra, the overtone spectra, is cut down.
Spectrum.
The spectrum, you know, when someone speaks, Nicanor speak, we can recognize when we know him, this is him. I don't even need to see him. Even when it's on a miserable phone line, I can maybe hear it's him because of some characteristics in the sound. That's due to the overtone spectra. And that is, of course, the richest in a good acoustical room with the live musician present. Time and space are right here, and the musician as well. Then I have a little bit of distance. I go into the studio, and the result is the black LP. And it's still a relatively rich spectra compared to what came then when the industry recognized the need to cut it down to digital recording, which is limiting. In our sound perception, we have, I think it's the 40th overtone, which we still can perceive, somewhere around 20,000 hertz. And the CD cuts it down much more than needed because it is too expensive to use the full spectrum of what we can hear.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Gotthard. Yeah. So if we're talking about exosomatic evolution, and if we want to ultimately externalize those aspects of ourselves, we will always have to deal with the question, are we externalizing it in the right way? And so it requires a knowledge of what the human being is and all of this. This is partially the reason why. And I also want to say something because this last part will touch a little bit more, but not really too much. But I just really want to touch on the question of spiritual science, the whole notion of spiritual science, because this is a very diverse group, and there's a lot of people here that are in spiritual science. And a number of them have approached me. Where's the spiritual science in the group? And I said, I've been talking about it all the time. so anyway, I just want to make it a little bit more explicit. And I know that this will not be comfortable with other parts of the group, but well, part of this is a kind of experience of hearing different perspectives. And ultimately, all of us will have to make the choice, which makes more sense for our lives. No one will tell us what that is. We get exposed to a lot of things, but then ultimately you will have to make that decision. And so the attempt here was to just broaden the conversation, to be able to include as much diversity as we can, but ultimately, the ultimate decision is yours. Yeah? So there's no process of conversion involved. Because converting, I mean. But I just wanted you to be open or access certain other facts that some other scientists are thinking in the larger community of science. That is the intention. Okay. So I actually was in the middle of a quote, given what we've seen in terms of the improbabilities of the universe. I mean, from that one perspective, and of course, if you do this other path of multiple universes, then you'll have another perspective. And it's interesting, I mean, one of the participants asked, so in terms of where scientists are at, how does it look like, the clustering of the scientists? Increasingly, they're moving in this direction. This has now become the majority position, but it doesn't mean that other scientists will take it on, right? Okay, so here's George Wald, the Nobel Prize winner. I was saying that he was saying that mind is the ultimate matrix out of which physical reality emerge. And it's really mind that composed the physical universe, so ultimately the universe is mind stuff, right? And remember the quotation from Max Planck, the founder of quantum physics, the co-founder, major figure. Now his quotation makes sense, given all of this, because I quoted him 2 days ago, but now his quote now becomes even more, it's now contextualized in this discussion, becomes more understandable. I regard consciousness as fundamental. This is Max Planck. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. It's the same message as George Wald. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about and regard as existing postulates consciousness. And so when you say postulates consciousness, we can shift it to Hawking and Einstein, who were saying, and even many scientists, part of their presumption is that there is an existing rational order in the world. How it got there is a whole other question, right? But the world is rational. And it seems that from this evidence that we currently know, that mind is very active in organizing physical matter. But on the other hand, there are other postulates there. So maybe one day they'll discover evidence for the multiple universe in such a plenty thing. And if that happens, we're back in the beginning. we will have to say, okay, that was all great and fine. Oh yeah, now we're living in 10 followed by 520 universes, where our universe is just one. Okay, so other scientists are wanting to go in that direction and try to prove that mathematically and then ultimately empirically. So that's where, in a sense, astrophysics is. Okay, now I want to quote an Australian, a very famous Australian from Melbourne. Yay! And he is a Nobel Prize winner in medicine. Okay, he already died. He was given the Nobel Prize in the 1960s for his work, basic work on synapses. Synapses of the human brain, the fundamental neural nets that are being used in AI are basically borrowing from his work. All the neuroscience in the 21st century are borrowing from his work. The work on synapses, the communication system, how one cell, nerve cell, transfers information to another, right? This Australian name is John Eccles. Eccles, you've heard of him? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, he's from Melbourne, so hey, what's up? Huh?
One clever person in Melbourne.
Right. So he's okay. So this is what he says. I maintain that the human mystery is incredibly demeaned by scientific reductionism, with its claims of promissory materialism to account for all the spiritual world in terms of patterns of neural activity. Then he says something very strong. This belief must be classed as superstition. We have to recognize that we are spiritual beings with souls existing in a spiritual world, as well as material beings with bodies and brains existing in a material world. By philosophy, John Eccles is a dualist. Actually, he says, I'm a trilateralist. He thinks that the world is existing in three parts, and the third world is the interaction between body and mind, body and consciousness. There's the other world there of how this whole thing happens, and he develops this in several books. You can take a close look at this, but it's interesting to see one of the founding fathers of neuroscience, because after all, no neuroscience work would happen without the work on synapses. I mean, his perspective, I think, by the way, he didn't always believe that. This is the interesting thing. He was a student of the famous brain scientist Sherrington in the 1930s. Well, maybe most of us who are younger have no relationship to the 1930s. But the program was, the brain research that there was to show that consciousness is in the brain. The brain secretes consciousness. And so he did that for 30 years. And he came to the opposite conclusion. And the interesting thing, he's also the discoverer of the neural basis of free will. And this is one of his famous works because supplementary motor area, this is part of the brain here. When you have an intention to do something, that intention is there prior to the firing of the synapses by 200 milliseconds. So we have the intention first and then the firing of the neurons. Okay, it's not the other way around. Firing of the neurons and then consciousness, right? That's why he changed his position and influenced another Nobel Prize winner called Roger Sperry. He won the Nobel Prize in brain research in 1980. And he wrote a book which is important for our subject. His book is called Science and Moral Priority. It's very interesting. I mean, he had a different worldview than Roger Sperry. He believed in, this is a big thing that's being used in science. When you use the word emergent, right? So it's a kind of different position. So unfortunately, we can say, through the complex interaction of non-living things, life emerged. It became emergent, although there are no such things in the physical laws that would create life. It became emergent. Once it's emergent, then it will start influencing how the very matrix from which it emerged, right? So it's now a higher order organization that is real in itself once it has emerged. That is Roger Sperry's position. But then he said, and that's why he had to write the book, Science and Moral Priority, because reflective thinking consciousness having emerged from consciousness, okay? Scientists don't exactly know what that emergence is, right? They just study the fact. And so, in other words, the lower aspects of the situation cannot predict what will emerge. But once it has emerged, what has emerged will control the lower order system, right? So just like consciousness, as we've seen, starts interfering or directing, for example, the way the neurons are firing in our brain, like neuroplasticity, and also the way genes will ultimately express themselves. That's why one genome can have 30,000 expressions. So emergence, and they call this downward causation. From a higher order to a lower order, downward causation, versus the normal belief of upward causation from the molecules down to, DNA down to the organism and behavior. So that's where he ended. And so Roger Sperry had a similar belief that once consciousness emerged, it can no longer be explained purely out of the matter, because now it was organizing matter. So it's very interesting to contemplate on AI, right, in that context. Emergence of an AI consciousness different from human. I'm not saying that it will, but it's a possibility, right? Because of emergence. But emergence has been highly criticized also philosophically, but that's where some of the people are creating a bridge here, right? Yeah, everything was physical, and then these higher properties emerge. Yeah. So the question is, where did they come from? For example, like, why is the Fibonacci number? You familiar with Fibonacci? Fibonacci, 1, 2, 3, what's that? 5, 8. Yeah, right? Okay, the plant world. It turns out the natural world is designed according to Fibonacci. So the question is, why? Why Fibonacci? The DNA is Fibonacci, the galaxy is Fibonacci, the human body is Fibonacci mathematically. Storms are Fibonacci. The question is why, right? Why a specific mathematical form? I mean, that would, in a sense, lead us away from emergence, right? There seems to be an underlying pattern or archetype in the structure of reality, which brings us back to the mind as matrix. Okay. Okay, here's a very interesting quote from Rudolf Steiner, the founder of modern spiritual science. And some of you, it's from his epistemological work, so his theory of knowledge. He's more because he was battling with Kant and all the prevailing positions during his time. And he says his belief is monism, right? He calls his philosophy monism. So, okay, I mean, a little background. Philosophy is basically being dualistic or monistic. Okay, dualism is like Eccles, right? Eccles with a variation. There is mind, there is matter. Those are two separate principles. And then the problem is how do you explain the interaction? They're two separate realms, right? So then the monist would say, no, there's only one principle. It's mind. It's a monism of the mind, or consciousness, or spirit, whatever you call it. And then or ideas. And then the second one, no, it's a monism of materialism. It's just matter. So different scientists are lining up in those different kinds of philosophical positions. We must also understand, and this is what the complaint of philosophers are, that many scientists are not philosophers. Okay, so you will have the phenomena, okay, I'm saying many, not all. There are many quantum physicists, for example, who have not looked at the implications of what quantum physics is saying. They're just interested in the technology, you just do it, it works. But they don't bother about what does non-locality means. Yeah, Steph?
When I was studying quantum physics, they told us that one of the philosophies they follow is the shut up and calculate philosophy. We don't know why it works, but we know it works.
Oh, there you go. Because Steph, that's why the quantum physicists are all spread out in a confusing number, because there are 8 mathematical equations to explain the phenomena. And out of the 8, you can choose what you like, right? And if you choose one, you'll end up in like traveling to the ends of the universe through a tunnel, right? And in another one, you'll have multiple universes. In another one, and so on, right? So, but this 8, that's the conundrum. Actually, this was actually what destroyed logical positivism, the philosophy, because we're saying one concept for one perception. So here's the perception. There are 8 concepts, mathematical concepts. And famous people who were founding fathers of logical positivism basically dropped their philosophy. Famous one is Ayer, Language, Truth, and Logic, right? Very famous tract. And he wrote this, and when he was older, he said, there's so many flaws in this book. But that gave birth to logical positivism, which among others would say that religious statements are basically meaningless because you cannot verify them. So anyway, thanks for that, Steph, because it's very interesting. I didn't know that. But there you go. That's why just do the technology and leave it to the philosophers or to others to figure out what non-locality means and all of that stuff. But there's some quantum physicists who are also taking a close look at the philosophical implications. Okay, so here's the quote. Take it as you will, because it's now resonating with the other quotes that I gave, okay? Okay, monism replaces the invisible forces of conventional science, replaces this with ideal connections. Okay, by the way, he's also criticizing idealism. So that's not what he actually meant. What he meant by ideal connections is that what you conceptualize is not an abstraction, because that would actually, okay, I better read this. Okay, I'll explain later when I've read the full quote because I'm preempting him. Yeah. Monism replaces forces of ideal connections which are gained through thinking. So when you, okay, the law. I'm holding myself back because for those who have not actually done the epistemology, this might sound like weird. But the laws of nature, okay, now here's it becomes clearer, are just such connections. So in a sense, Steiner philosophically is a realist, not a nominalist, which means historically in philosophy, if you're a nominalist, concepts are just abstractions that have nothing to do with reality. But Steiner's concept of a concept is that the laws of nature out there and what we perceive here is actually, those ideas are actually the laws of nature working out there. There's no duality. Do you see that? Yeah. And that's why it's interesting if you put that in the mathematical context that I spoke about yesterday. In astrophysics, mathematics first, which are the ideal connections that they're seeing from the phenomena of the universe. And then they discover natural laws. Yeah? But they are actually the natural law. You see what I'm saying? So for Steiner, there's no duality of mind and matter, because we access We access the laws through our mind. So when we perceive, for example, I'll walk through a forest, and I'm in a strange country like Australia. I'm not familiar with the species. Or in New Zealand, where I was, where's Sylvia? Okay, yeah, my even stranger. So I go through to a sort of forest there and said, it's all strange to me. I have not been programmed to have concepts about what I'm seeing. So all I see is perception. Okay, so I have no concepts. But the moment I stay long enough and start to study the phenomena, I have certain concepts, and then I start to discover natural laws. Yeah.
Just say that in fact, in observing that you have no concepts, you have a concept.
My reflection on my concept, yeah.
Because if
Not-
it's pure percept, you can't even say that.
No, I can say it actually, because of the way I'm constructed. I have to think about my experiences, right? That's what I'm saying. So the human beings constituted on two ends, basically. The perceptual end, what we perceive, and the thinking end, which makes sense of what we perceive. So it's more in that sense. Yeah, okay. So, but what we've seen earlier is that mathematics is a kind of apprehension. It's a kind of seeing. Things that are not yet visible, right, to the physical. Okay, that's why he says this thing. The laws of nature are just such connections. They, the things, exist in indivisible unity with its laws. Okay, I have to give an explanation here. The indivisible unity of concept and percept, they're one in nature. The fact that it appears as separated for us is an issue of our own organization. It's not an issue for nature. The problem of knowledge, the problem of epistemology is a human problem. It's not the problem of nature. Nature is constituted as a whole, and that wholeness is a conceptual and a perceptual side together. This is what he's saying. Okay, so that's why he says, the things, nature, the things, exist in indivisible unity with these laws, which are discovered through thinking. Therefore, our mind is not to be conceived of as a receptacle for the ideal world. So there's no passivity of an ideal world containing thoughts within themselves. So he's just attacking idealism. So you can see he's trying to straddle between idealism and materialism. He's trying to create a new kind of understanding of how the two go together. And our mind is not to be conceived of as a receptacle for the ideal world, which idealists tend to think, containing the thoughts within itself, okay? Just as like Plato would do that, right? But as an organ which perceives the thoughts. So thinking is an organ which perceives the thoughts. Because if you don't think, you cannot see the ideal connections, right? It is an organ of apprehension, not apprehensive, right? just as are the eyes and the ear, but on a different level of existence. Okay, thinking, here's a kind of shocking statement. Thinking as an organ of apprehension perceives the thought content of the world. Okay, so here he's moving closer to Einstein and all the scientists today, what they presume, right? So basically, there it's clear that the world has thought content. That's why we can think about them, we can have ideas about them. And it is thinking that sees those connections, and those connections are nothing but the thought content of the world, which in reality, in a non-dualist position, they are the laws of the world. Okay? Because thinking connects the different facets of experience, and we cannot have any sense of meaning if we're not able to bring all this all together. It's our thinking that does that. So he's pointing to a deeper understanding of what thinking is as functioning. It's both cognitive, but at the same time is perceiving this thought content. But this perception expresses itself in relationships that become the laws of nature for us, but the laws of nature and its content are an indivisible unity. Okay, you're following so far? Okay. Then he comes to the same conclusion as Wald and all the others, Einstein, Hawking, and so on. He says, our theory of knowledge leads to the positive conclusion that thought is the essential nature of the world. So instead of mind that the other scientists are using, it just says thought. But it's basically, that's why we can discover rational laws. That is presumed by science itself. There are no laws if the world has no reason. There are no laws if the world has no reason itself embedded in it. Okay? Now, wow. Okay, I missed out a very important quotation. But so I'll have to do this verbally. How many of you are familiar with the name Antony Flew? Yeah, one. At least one. Who's Antony Flew?
He was the scientist whose thought led to the serious proposition that he could prove there was no God.
Okay. Antony Flew, if you were born in my generation, I really had a hard time with him. He was so good. I mean, he was the most distinguished atheist in the 20th century. I mean, I say that because the atheists themselves say that. A lot of them drank from his cup, so to speak, because he was the first philosopher to develop a whole-scale philosophical argument for atheism. And people from the theistic position really had a hard time trying to... So he was very famous. And this is a kind of short background, but you should really read some of his books. And I think he's still alive, or maybe he died recently, I'm not sure. But anyway, he died. He died recently.
Yeah, I think that he put out this other book in
2004. So most of his writings for 50 years were about there's no God. And he tried to show this philosophically, scientifically, and so on. And a lot of scientists were really influenced by it. And he had some really amazing arguments. His was really the most sophisticated. And then something happened in 2004. He was exposed to this, the anthropic principle, the fine-tuning, and then he wrote a book that is called There Is, instead of no God, he crosses it out, there is a God. So there was, of course, since he was like a kind of teacher of a whole generation of people who don't believe in God, they were deeply affected by this. They really criticized him. Then they said, in your old age, that's why you're really scared, right? That's why you changed your mind, because now you're really old. That's what he was saying, no? In your old age, you don't know what's going to happen to you. That's why all of a sudden you're going to die soon. That's why you're believing in God, right? So, just in case, right? Well, he answers back. He says, by the way, my position always has been that there's no afterlife, and it has not changed. Okay, so this is very interesting. He said his position has not changed, that there's no afterlife. Even now that he believes in God, there's no afterlife. Okay, that is his position. And so I mention him in this context because people who study this deeply, I really have to think it through. the nature of the universe, is it really that or something else? So it's just important, that book, if you want to see, okay, in the first part of the book, he describes why he was an atheist. And it's a very powerful argument. And it's actually generated a lot of writings just in response to him. Among those who believe there was a God, theistic philosophers were just responding to him like crazy because he had a very powerful argument. And then the second part of the book talks about why he started thinking differently. And the interesting thing was that he said, it's not really surprising that I changed my mind, because in the end, I had only one real guiding principle as a philosopher. He said, follow where the evidence leads. That's what he said. That explained why he did that. Okay, now his co-author, and I'll quote from him, he wrote this book with another former atheist, and who became his co-author. The two of them would regularly hold workshops like this, but it's purely to explain why there's no God. So then this guy's name, Anthony Flew, right? Okay. So his co-author then writes this appendix to analyze the writings of Dawkins, Dennett, and what Wired called the New Atheism, which basically started in 2006. Wired magazine did a whole article on the New Atheism. God is Dead. That's the title of Dawkins. God is dead, or there's no God, or whatever it is. The writings of the different philosophers and scientists. So he writes this appendix, and then he says, okay, as I see it, 5 phenomena are evident in our immediate experience that can only be explained in terms of the existence of God. Okay, the first one we've discussed, he said, these are, first, the rationality implicit in all our experience of the physical world. Where does that rationality come from? Both atheistic and theistic scientists would presume that rationality in the world. So where does that come from, this order, the immense order that Hawkins was talking about? Where does that come from? Then the second is life. So it's interesting because he starts to go, and then consciousness, he starts taking a look at the whole natural evolution, and each step there is a kind of gap. It's a barrier. And consciousness is the third, the ability to be aware. The fourth, conceptual thought. The power of articulating and understanding meaningful signals, such as are embedded in language. Which reminds me, if there's a DNA code, who wrote the code, right? Why all of a sudden do we have a coded message which did not develop by chance, as we saw? And fifth, the human self, the center of consciousness, thought, and action. Because ultimately, our notion of who we are is dependent on what we think about what is life, what is matter, what does our consciousness mean, what do our belief system mean, because all of this is being held by our natural experience that we have an I, which is free to do these things, right? So, he was just doing this, and those who are familiar with spiritual science can see immediately the connection, right? And I'm gonna give that to you as a homework. Because you're seeing there the 4 basic principles of the human being. Physical body, right? Life, consciousness, sense of self, and the thinking that develops out of that. It's just really interesting that modern science has come to a point when they recognize that there is this kind of dead end, right? So far. That's why John Eccles, the Australian from Melbourne, calls this promissory materialism. We don't have the answer now, but in 100 years we will have it. And that's what he calls promissory materialism. We don't have it now, but this framework is definitely correct. We'll figure it out in 100 years or less. So those gaps, right, those mathematical gaps in the probabilities of chance. So from a different perspective, if you were going to explain evolution, this is the drawing that I would, at certain points, when matter was kind of organized, then life was able to actually operate in it. It was complex enough because life has different properties from non-matter, and so on. So, okay, where does that take us now in terms of the kind of conclusion? And I'm sure there's a lot of questions. I went over your questions and I said, remember the phenomenology that has been guiding me in these presentations? And I said, oh God, this will take another week to answer all of these questions. So I just chose the most important, the most basic, the most fundamental, and then we can work it out through our reason what the answers may be on the others. And then maybe in the question and answer, we can take a closer look at it. Okay, but I just want to say, okay, because the whole question of moral technology, okay, morality assumes a certain backdrop of knowledge, okay, about the way the world works. That's the fundamental. And then because morality is about action, it's about doing. If you don't have, you can have a thinking about it, but it's only when you do it that it will start having impact on the world. So it depends on what kind of images we have about the world, what the human being is, what is life, what is consciousness. Those large questions, that's why I tried to give an indication where modern science is there. By the way, if modern science has already created life in the laboratory, I would not have accepted this invitation. Rose. That means to say, the other perspective of science has won the day, right? And by the way, it's not a battle between which perspective. It's really a dialogue between honest people who are really trying to make sense of existence. And their upbringing brings them to a certain kind of perspective, and another upbringing brings them to a certain kind of perspective. We are all programmed in our upbringing. Remember the thing that I told you about the parent study in the United States? 10,000 injunctions of do's or don'ts, which deeply embed into our memory and even start changing aspects of our genome. We're all programmed, but then we have to reach a point when we start reflecting on this programming on ourselves. Otherwise, we'll never be free. So it does matter a lot what kind of assessment we have of the world, because from there, we will create technologies out of our knowledge of the world. By the way, the root word of technology, some of you already know, and this is very interesting because there's also an evolution of the meaning. What is the root word of technology? Techne. You got it. Technology is techne. A Greek word which in the original meaning meant art. Yeah, correct. Art. So that is very interesting. The connection of technology and art, because that kind of understanding is lost. When I was still in college a long time ago, in the university, we had courses like the science and art of animal husbandry. I'm an agriculture. And took up biology. It's always the science and art. So they're emphasizing the thinking side, which is very different from how you actually do it, right? Your mind can think of infinite stuff, amazing stuff. But when you start to do it, you now have to form it to a specific medium, right? Which is art. And that medium can be anything, including concepts. Philosophers to paraphrase Steiner, are artists in the realm of concepts. Okay? So anything can actually be art. So AI, understood in the old sense of techne, is actually a form of art. Okay? So the question is, and that's why I think the experience of Gotthard was very important. If we don't understand fully something, how can we fully express it into an appropriate art form? Yeah, and this is where the moral question comes in. Morality presumes a certain understanding about what I said earlier, about the nature of things, right? So the question is, do you want to freely and consciously violate where the universe has been heading for 14 billion years? The answer is both yes and no, right? I mean, it's inherent in our freedom. I mean, but we have to come to that point where we're going to say, we are going to consciously carry on the future of evolution, at least in this aspect, in our sphere of influence here in the solar system. Evolution will take a particular direction like this because it's now going to be, the future evolution is now going to be fueled by human creativity. There's no doubt about it. Forget, I mean, the traditions can help, but we're dealing here with the future when all things are possible. Okay, when all things are possible. So in a sense, morality also deals with the future. And because you are now embedding a sense, and that embedding will have a lot of challenges, embedding in a medium. And that's why I often encourage young people, it's okay to make mistakes. Make them early and learn from them. By the way, that's the principle of Silicon Valley innovation. They actually extol the virtue of making mistakes. There have been several cover stories in Business Week and Forbes and all of this about the wisdom of mistakes. Yeah, take a look at iPhone, right? iPhone 1.0, 1.3.0, 3.4, now 0.6, etc. No, right? It's always being reiterated. And that's why I mentioned a little bit earlier the problem of the coding, the code, because there's a lot of glitches in codes, human error. But that's not the end point. The end point is that how do we deal with that? But it's the given state of things that programming is not a perfect science. It can be, but they haven't, actually until now, they're still trying to figure it out.
I think things would become too static then.
I beg your pardon?
I think perfection brings stasis. It wouldn't be such a great thing.
Yeah, especially,
How can you have creativity when everything's already perfect?
yeah. No, because the human being is changing all the time. The universe is unfolding. Other aspects of nature are reacting, right? And other human beings are reacting to the technology. And that's why it's fantastic exercise of Steph, the AI, Ruth. I was laughing the whole afternoon. I thought my blood pressure will go up. And so I went to the room and checked, wow, it's normal. So this is healthy. I want more laughter. And that's why I was telling Rose, I was kind of torn between trying to prepare for this talk and joining the fun last night. I could hear laughter. But it was a perfect exercise, right? And what was funny to me was that some people really took their role seriously. And it became very realistic. Like John, I was laughing at John a lot. He was the supervisor of the school. And then all of a sudden, he played very comfortable. It was very comfortable in that position. It was starting to facilitate this complex dialogue. And then I asked John, what's your background? He said, this is exactly what I do for a living. So it's a kind of education facilitator, right? On policy issues and complex stuff.
It also becomes a trap.
Right.
Evidence yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah, because now you're hearing other perspectives, right? So, Steph, thanks a lot. Wonderful, beautiful exercise. So, and yeah, so that is the crux of the moral technology question. The crux is, whose worldview will the machine inhabit? Whose worldview will the machine carry out? Either worldview, it will not be perfect. But that is the key question, and no one can answer that. And that's why, towards the end of this session, I wanted to bring in the social dimension to the whole thing. Because as I mentioned already in the beginning, this kind of conversation cannot take place in a small group. That's why I allowed myself, after de facto knowing that this was going to be taped, so that other people have access to it. This is a conversation about the future of humanity, and it's not an ordinary conversation. Because it's the future whether we will survive our latest inventions or the world will be quite different. And this is why I'm really happy knowing the nature of programming that the AI community has stepped up to the challenge and put their feet where the mouth is. I mean, they will be the ones that will know how imperfect the programming is. That's why they're pretty worried. Because no human being today can hold in their consciousness millions of codes. That's just Microsoft, by the way, right? So AI, maybe, I assume, I haven't built a robot, but I think it's much more complicated than Microsoft, the 46 million codes. And then when you talk about programming, okay, this is what IBM is thinking of. IBM introduced the Internet of Things. Their vision is one world interconnected with the internet. So plants, animals, humans, everything, buildings will all be wired. So they're now in the step of realizing that. Okay, they have, I think somebody might correct me, but the Blue Gene computer is an IBM computer which has a shocking speed of 400 trillion calculations a second. And they aim to go way beyond that. There are almost 400,000 processors there, parallel calculating units in that computer. And it takes an amount of electricity, the equivalent of a nuclear power plant. Of course, they're going to try to scale it down some more, miniaturize it. And so the Internet of Things, they're not going to literally go out there and start tagging the plants and putting microprocessors there. They're actually going to fuse this with nanotechnology and genetic engineering. Okay, so this is a vision. So the question is, I mean, one day you're waking up in nature. Nature is wired. But that nature is genetically engineered nature and not a nanotech nature. Okay, so the question is, how do we deal with that? And that is a decision not one person can make. It will have to be a decision that will be made by humanity as a whole, however impossible that is, but that there has to be wide-scale conversation. Because we are going to literally invent, we're already doing it, what the future would look like. The future that we will have in 10 years is going to be so different than the future that we have now because of the acceleration of technology. That's why the moral question of this technology is so important, because the question then goes back. What is our understanding of reality that we will then encode in the thought structure of the algorithms of the program, the software that will run these machines? That is a key question, and morality will totally be determined. What is the nature of reality, right? No, I mean, the young people at the back also suddenly made one move. Yeah. Playful creation, it should be, right? In play, there is freedom. Yeah. Which, by the way, that's the subject of a philosophical book, right? By Schiller, which is quite influential in education circles. The education of the human being, right? The friend of Goethe, who said, in between the iron necessity of our thought structures and the iron necessity of our instincts, our freedom is in play, basically also art. So, I just want to say that this question, unfortunately, will not be solved without a massive restructuring of our society. The way our society currently unfolds, it is structured for decisions to be made by elites, not by ordinary people. It would be nice if the elites heard the points of views that are in this room. But ultimately, this decision is going to be made by giant corporations who have the funds to do this, government institutions that are having budgets of billions. So the question is really a question for civil society to get organized, because right now there's hardly any notion that this thing is going on, because they're all concerned about human rights, environment, and all of this. And many of the activists are geeks, love technology. In fact, they use it a lot in their organizing. So I noticed that because I tried to bring up that question one time among a very interesting group of global civil society leaders, and they couldn't hear the question because they were not familiar with what's going on. Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. In a circle of few people, the future of humanity is being discussed. What is the fate of humanity? Shouldn't we be part of that conversation? In some way, find a voice, whatever voice it is, to say some way, what is our future? Or we can all just sit back, sit back, and just allow things to happen. And that's why I think the workshop this afternoon with Steph is very important in terms of how what is percolating inside you can find a way, because otherwise this will end up all talk. I mean, the gravity of the problem is very big, as you can see. So what are we going to do about it? Yeah. Okay. So in ending, okay, up to this point, the human mind has been able to create something, create the best out of a given situation. I'm saying up to this point. That is the source of hope that Alex was asking about the other day. What is the hope of humanity? There's a lot of good-intentioned people in this world. My own learning, working very closely, trying to influence how government makes decisions, is that I had to change my perspective of government. Because in the beginning, I was in the outside, government was one thing, and I was just bashing this thing down. And then I found out the majority of government were good people. They were well-intentioned, but they're caught in a system. A system where it's almost military-like. I was offered the cabinet position of environment minister in the Philippines, and I refused it because my condition was the president of the Philippines should understand that I'm answerable to civil society, not to the president. And of course, that cannot be the basis of the structure, because if you're the president, and what you say, that's law for all cabinet members. And that's how a good number of my friends who accepted that have become corrupted in the last 10 years. So, in other words, this is what I mean to say, but there are internal structural constraints. Government basically is no different from the military. And the people caught in the lower ranks, who may be ethical, moral, good-willed, they're left following because they have no jobs. If they quit the job, that's why I'm not surprised that another source of hope is a lot of social entrepreneurs. And Sylvia here from New Zealand is an example of that development, who are trying to create a very different world out of very different values than the existing economic system, that even the founder, Adam Smith, never envisioned that this world will be like that. He had this book, what was his book, the famous book? It was like...
Commonwealth of Nations?
No, his book was about the wealth of nations. Yeah, the wealth of nations. Adam Smith argued this, but became very famous. But 15 years before that, or 17 years before that, he had a book, a best-selling book. It was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. That was the context of the wealth of nations, because he was presuming that this kind of capitalism will work if people had refined higher moral standards. And the people in University of Chicago that developed the neoliberal economics that is in the WTO and runs the economies of the world forgot that book, right? And focused on competition as the main engine of the world, right? But Adam Smith never had that vision. If you are going to be morally upright in a competitive mood, you're not going to destroy the other person. That was his assumption. That's why theory of moral sentiments, that part of Adam Smith's work is neglected. And this is what social entrepreneurs, without knowing it, are trying to resurrect by the tens of thousands around the world. The Philippines just passed a law on social entrepreneurship. They estimated about 300,000 social entrepreneurs in the Philippines, and I'm sure it's larger in many other countries. There's a whole movement driven by millennials, people the age of the young people here, who are trying to create out of a different concept of the world, a different concept of justice, equality, compassion, and all of that. They would create a different economic system. It's nothing different from AI. Because the question remains in the end, what does it mean to be human? And what does it mean to externalize these human qualities in the whole journey of exosomatic evolution? No one can give an answer to that. It will totally depend on how we are with each other as human beings. Thank you. Yeah.